The neon sign of Jerry's all-night diner buzzed with an erratic, dying hum, casting a sickly yellow light over the wet pavement where Keisha stood, shivering in the biting wind. It was 3 a.m, and the exhaustion settled deep in her bones, a heavy weight that made her red uniform vest feel like a suit of armor she could no longer carry. She was 27, but tonight she felt decades older, her hands chapped from scrubbing tables and her feet throbbing inside worn-out sneakers. The manager had yelled at her twice for moving too slowly, but he didn't understand the kind of tired that comes from working double shifts just to keep the lights on in a studio apartment that smelled of damp wood and hopelessness. She grabbed a heavy black trash bag, the plastic slick with grease, and shoved the back door open with her shoulder, stepping into the narrow, suffocating alleyway behind the diner. The air here was thick with the scent of stale frying oil and urban decay, a sharp contrast to the crisp, white shirt she wore beneath her vest, which she meticulously ironed every morning in a desperate attempt to maintain dignity in a life that tried to strip it away. She heaved the bag toward the overflowing dumpster, her breath misting in the cold air, but stopped mid-swing when she saw the shape. It wasn't a pile of discarded boxes or a stray dog seeking shelter. It was a man, crumpled awkwardly among the refuse, his body twisted as if he had been tossed there like the very garbage she held in her hands. Keisha dropped the bag, her heart hammering against her ribs, and took a cautious step forward, her eyes adjusting to the shadows. He was Asian, perhaps in his mid-30s, wearing a suit that, even torn and mud-stained, whispered of a wealth she couldn't comprehend. Fine silk lining, a cut that fit perfectly even in his ruin. But now, he was broken, his face bruised and pale, a stark, terrifying stillness radiating from him. Most people would have turned away, afraid of the trouble, afraid of the police, or simply too indifferent to care, but Keisha felt a pull in her chest, a familiar ache of empathy that had always been her greatest weakness and her only strength. She knelt in the grime, disregarding the mud staining her white trousers, and touched his shoulder. He groaned, a low, guttural sound of agony that tore through the silence of the alley. He was alive, but only just. Keisha looked around frantically, but the alley was deserted, a forgotten vein of the city where bad things happened and were quickly washed away by the rain. She couldn't leave him here. The temperature was dropping, and the way he shivered, uncontrollable tremors racking his frame, told her he wouldn't survive the night. It was a moment of moral contradiction that froze her. She had less than nothing, barely enough food for herself, yet here was a life demanding to be saved. With a surge of adrenaline fueled by desperation, she looped her arms under his, gritting her teeth as she pulled. He was heavy, dead weight against her slender frame, but she hauled him up, his expensive leather shoes dragging through the sludge. "I got you," she whispered, the words trembling in the cold air, more for herself than for him. "I don't know who did this to you, but I got you." It was a slow, agonizing journey to her beat-up sedan parked a block away, every step a battle against gravity and exhaustion, but she didn't let go. She couldn't. In the darkness of that alley, saving him felt like the only thing that mattered, a defiance against a cruel world that treated people like trash. The drive to her apartment was a blur of anxiety and the rhythmic sweeping of windshield wipers. The man slumped unconscious in the passenger seat, his head lolling against the window with every turn. Keisha kept glancing at him, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios, but the underlying feeling was a fierce, protective instinct she hadn't known she possessed. When they finally arrived, navigating the stairs to her second-floor apartment was a nightmare of physical exertion. She practically carried him, his arm draped over her shoulder, her own legs burning with the effort. Inside, her apartment was small and sparsely furnished, a faded beige sofa, a wobbly wooden table, and peeling wallpaper that hinted at years of neglect, but it was warm. She lowered him onto the sofa, the only comfortable piece of furniture she owned, and collapsed into the chair opposite him for a moment, gasping for breath. The contrast was jarring. A man who looked like a fallen prince, bleeding onto the cushions of a woman who counted pennies to buy bread. She fetched a bowl of warm water and a clean washcloth, her hands steady now that the immediate physical struggle was over. Kneeling beside the sofa, she began to gently clean the grime and dried blood from his face. Beneath the bruises, his features were striking: sharp cheekbones, a strong jawline, and jet-black hair that fell over his forehead. He was handsome, undeniably so, but it was the vulnerability in his unconscious state that struck her most. He flinched slightly as the cloth grazed a cut on his temple, and she pulled back, murmuring soft apologies. "It's okay," she soothed, her voice a low hum in the quiet room. "You're safe now." She unbuttoned his ruined jacket, revealing a dress shirt that had once been pristine white, now stained dark with mud and blood. As she worked, she noticed the lack of a wallet or phone. Whoever had done this had stripped him of his identity, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back. It was a terrifying thought, but it also leveled the playing field between them. In this room, he wasn't a stranger from a different world. He was just a human being in pain, and she was the only one there to witness it. Keisha spent the next hour tending to him with a tenderness that defied the harshness of her own life. She used her small first aid kit, applying antiseptic to his cuts and bandaging the worst of them. She covered him with her thickest quilt, a patchwork of colors that looked bright and chaotic against his somber suit. The intimacy of the act, caring for a stranger's body, touching his skin, ensuring his comfort, created a silent, invisible thread between them. She sat on the floor beside the sofa, watching the rise and fall of his chest, exhaustion finally overtaking her adrenaline. She didn't know his name, didn't know if he was a criminal or a saint, but looking at his face, smoothed now in sleep, she felt a strange sense of purpose. Her life had been a series of closed doors and missed opportunities, a linear path of struggle, but tonight, the script had changed. She fell asleep with her head resting on the edge of the sofa, her hand hovering near his, a silent guardian in the dim light of the city. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, dust motes dancing in the pale morning beams, when the man finally stirred. It wasn't a sudden awakening, but a slow, painful return to consciousness. Keisha was already awake, sitting at her small kitchen table with a mug of cheap coffee, watching him. She saw his eyes flutter open, dark, deep eyes that immediately darted around the room in confusion and panic. He tried to sit up, but a groan escaped his lips, and he fell back against the cushions, clutching his side. Keisha was beside him in an instant, her presence calm and grounding. "Don't move too fast," she said softly, keeping a respectful distance, but close enough to help if he fell. "You're hurt. I found you." Behind the diner, he looked at her, really looked at her, his gaze intense and searching. He didn't speak immediately. It was as if he was assessing the threat level, his mind piecing together the fragments of a shattered memory. When he finally spoke, his voice was a rasp, dry and cracked. "Who are you?" "I'm Keisha," she answered, offering him a glass of water. He took it with a shaking hand, his fingers brushing against hers, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt of awareness through them both. "I work at the diner." "You are in bad shape." He drank greedily, the water seeming to revive him slightly. He looked down at his bandaged hands, then at the quilt covering him, and finally at the small, impoverished room. It was a world away from the penthouses and boardrooms he was used to, though he said nothing of that. Minho, that was his name, though he held it back for now, felt a wave of shame wash over him. To be seen like this, weak and discarded, was a humiliation he had never known. But when he looked back at Keisha, he saw no judgment in her eyes, only a warm, patient concern. "Thank you," he whispered, the English words feeling heavy on his tongue. "I have nothing to give you." Keisha smiled, a sad, weary smile that reached her eyes. "I didn't do it for a reward," she said simply. She moved to the kitchenette and ladled some soup into a bowl, plain broth with a few vegetables, the best she could offer. As she handed it to him, the disparity between them hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. He was a man who had clearly known the finest things, now eating soup from a chipped bowl in a stranger's apartment. Yet, as he ate, Minho realized it was the warmest meal he had tasted in years. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was heavy with unasked questions and a growing, tentative trust. He watched her move around the small space, tidying up, her red vest hanging on the back of a chair like a reminder of the reality, waiting outside. She was poor, clearly struggling to survive, yet she had shared what little she had with him. It was a lesson in humanity he hadn't expected to learn in the gutter. "I can't stay," he said suddenly, the instinct to run, to hide his shame, flaring up. He tried to stand, his legs wobbling dangerously. Keisha stepped in, her hands firm on his shoulders, gently pushing him back down. "You can't walk," she stated, her voice firm but kind. "And whoever did this to you, they might still be out there. You're safe here. Just rest for a while." Minho looked at her, seeing the strength in her jaw, the determination in her posture. She was offering him sanctuary at a cost to herself he couldn't yet calculate. Slowly, he nodded, surrendering to the weakness of his body and the unexpected kindness of her heart. In that moment, the waitress and the billionaire were just two people sheltering from a storm, the boundaries of their worlds blurring in the quiet intimacy of the morning. Days turned into a week, and a fragile routine began to form within the walls of the small apartment. Minho's recovery was slow. His body was a map of bruises that turned from angry purple to sickly yellow, and his ribs ached with every breath. He spent the days lying on the sofa or sitting by the window, watching the world below, a world of gray concrete and rushing people that seemed so distant from the stillness of Keisha's home. He learned the rhythm of her life, the way she woke before dawn, the sound of the shower running, the smell of burnt toast because the toaster was broken, and the heavy sigh she released when she returned late at night, smelling of grease and fatigue. He saw the stack of bills on the kitchen counter growing higher, the red envelopes that signaled urgency and debt. It gnawed him. He, who could buy this entire building with a signature, was now a burden on a woman who could barely feed herself. He hadn't told her who he was, the heir to the Han conglomerate, the man betrayed by his own brother and left for dead. To speak it aloud felt like inviting the danger into her home, and perhaps a part of him enjoyed being just Min, a man without a title, seen only for who he was in the moment. One evening, Keisha came home looking more defeated than usual. Her shoulders were slumped, and the light in her eyes had dimmed. She didn't say anything, just kicked off her shoes and sat at the table, burying her face in her hands. Minho, who had been practicing walking around the room to regain his strength, moved toward her. He moved silently, his expensive instincts for reading people shifting from boardroom negotiations to emotional observation. "Keisha," he said softly. She looked up, startled, and quickly wiped a tear from her cheek. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice thick. "Just a long shift. The landlord. He wants the rent by Friday, or I'm out." The admission hung in the air, a brutal reality check. Minho felt a surge of impotent rage, not at the landlord, but at his own helplessness. He had no access to his accounts, no phone, no way to contact his loyalists without alerting his enemies. "I will pay you back," he said, his voice intense, his eyes locking onto hers. "Every cent. I promise you." Keisha managed a weak chuckle, shaking her head. "You don't have a cent, Min. And that's okay. We'll figure it out." "I always do." She stood up and walked over to the fridge, pulling out the last of the eggs. "How about an omelet?" It's gourmet night, her attempt at humor, her refusal to break down or blame him for the extra mouth to feed, pierced through his defenses. He walked over to her, reaching out to take the carton from her hands. "Let me," he said. "I can cook." She looked surprised but yielded. They stood side by side in the tiny kitchenette, their elbows brushing. He whisked the eggs with a precision that betrayed his upbringing, while she toasted the bread. It was a domestic scene that felt incredibly foreign, yet deeply right to him. As they ate, the tension of the looming eviction faded into the background, replaced by a quiet companionship. Minho found himself telling her small fragments of his life, not the wealth, but the loneliness. He spoke of a cold childhood, of a house that was a museum rather than a home. Keisha listened, her eyes warm and understanding, absorbing his pain as if it were her own. "Sounds like we both grew up hungry," she said thoughtfully. Just for different things that night, as Keisha prepared her makeshift bed on the floor, having insisted he keep the sofa until he was fully healed, Minho made a silent vow. He watched her from the darkness, the moonlight tracing the curve of her cheek. He would not let her fall. He would reclaim his throne, not for power, not for revenge, but to lay the world at the feet of the woman who had saved him when he was nothing but trash in an alleyway. The emotional peak of their confinement came on a night of torrential rain, the kind of storm that rattled the window panes and made the world feel small and enclosed. The thunder was a constant, rolling growl, echoing the tension that had been building between them. Keisha was pacing the room, the stress of the impending eviction deadline finally cracking her composure. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "I've picked up 3 extra shifts, but it's not enough. If I lose this place," she trailed off, unable to voice the fear of homelessness that had shadowed her entire life. Minho sat on the edge of the sofa, his healing ribs aching in the damp weather. He couldn't watch this anymore. He couldn't watch her drown while he sat dry on the shore. He stood up, ignoring the pain, and crossed the room to intercept her path. "Keisha," he said, his voice commanding in a way she hadn't heard before. He reached out and took both her hands in his. His grip was firm, his skin warm against hers. She stopped pacing and looked up at him, her eyes wide and brimming with unshed tears. The distance between them vanished. In the dim light of the apartment, with the storm raging outside, they were the only 2 people in existence. "Look at me," he urged gently. "You are not going to lose this place." "I won't let that happen," she searched his face, confused by the certainty in his tone. "How can you stop it, Min?" She stopped herself, not wanting to hurt him, but he finished the sentence for her. "I am a man who owes you his life. Do you trust me?" The question hung heavy in the air, charged with an energy that was no longer just gratitude. It was attraction, deep and magnetic. Keisha felt her heart rate spike, the warmth of his hands traveling up her arms. She saw the strength returning to him, a glimpse of the powerful man he must have been before the fall. "I trust you," she whispered, and she realized it was true. Despite the absurdity of the situation, despite his lack of resources, she believed him. Minho raised one hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a stray tear. The gesture was incredibly tender, a silent confession of the feelings he had been harboring. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, closing his eyes as he breathed in her scent, soap and rain and resilience. "I need to make a call," he said quietly, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. "It is dangerous, but it is time." Keisha didn't ask for details. She understood that the period of hiding was over. The safety of the cocoon they had built was shattering, forced open by necessity. But in that moment, the fear was secondary to the connection vibrating between them. She placed her hand over his, pressing it closer to her cheek. "Okay," she said, her voice steady now. "Whatever you need to do. I'm with you." It was a pact, sealed not with a contract but with a touch. As the thunder crashed overhead, Minho knew that walking out that door to reclaim his identity was the only way to save her, even if it meant risking the very life she had given back to him. The romance that had been a slow ember was now aflame, and it would either light their way out of the darkness or burn them both to ash. The air in the apartment had shifted, charged with the electric hum of a decision that could not be unmade. Minho held Keisha's gaze for a long moment, his eyes conveying a depth of gratitude and intensity that made her breath hitch in her throat. He borrowed her cracked smartphone, his fingers moving with a dexterity and purpose that seemed at odds with the battered man she had nursed back to health. He walked to the window, turning his back to the room, and dialed a number from memory. When he spoke, the language changed. He switched to rapid, commanding Korean, his voice dropping an octave, shedding the vulnerability of the injured stray and assuming the cold, hard authority of a man accustomed to moving mountains. Keisha stood by the kitchen counter, wrapping her arms around herself, feeling a sudden, chilling distance open up between them. The man standing by the window was a stranger again, a titan of industry waking from a slumber, and the smallness of her life felt painfully acute against the shadow of his returning power. She watched the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hand clenched into a fist against the sill, and she realized that the quiet domesticity they had shared was dissolving like sugar in hot water. When the call ended, Minho stood silent for a long time, staring out at the rain-slicked streets where his destiny was rushing to meet him. He turned back to her slowly, and the mask of the ruthless executive slipped, revealing the man who had cooked eggs in her tiny kitchen. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, closing the physical gap that the phone call had created. "It is done," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "My team. They thought I was dead. They are coming," Keisha nodded, unable to speak, fighting the sting of tears. She felt foolish for the hope she had nurtured, the silly fantasy that they could stay in this bubble forever. "So you go back to your castle," she whispered, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "And I go back to double shifts." It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact, a resignation to the natural order of their disparate worlds. Minho's expression darkened, pained by her resignation. He reached out, his hands framing her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw with a reverence that made her knees weak. "No," he said fiercely. "Do not say that. You are the only reason I am breathing. Do you think I would leave you behind?" The raw honesty in his eyes stripped away her defenses. The romance that had been a quiet undercurrent exploded to the surface. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, breathing in her presence as if it were the only oxygen in the room. "I have to go alone at first," he admitted, the words pained, "to secure my position, to make sure it is safe. But I will come back. I swear it on my life, Keisha. I will come back for you." It was a promise made in the dim light of poverty, but it carried the weight of a vow. He kissed her then, not tentatively as he might have before, but with a desperate, claiming hunger. It was a kiss of farewell and a kiss of promise, tasting of rain and longing, sealing a bond that defied the logic of their circumstances. For a few precious seconds, the billionaire and the waitress were simply a man and a woman clinging to each other in the face of an uncertain storm. The arrival of Minho's extraction team was a spectacle that shattered the quiet anonymity of Keisha's neighborhood. It wasn't just a car, it was a convoy of 3 sleek, armored black SUVs that prowled down the narrow street like apex predators entering a grazing field. The flashing lights were silent, but the presence was deafening. Neighbors peeked through blinds, and the ambient noise of the city seemed to hush in reverence to such blatant displays of power. Keisha stood at the door of her apartment building, shivering in the cold night air, watching as men in dark suits spilled out of the vehicles with military precision. They formed a perimeter, their earpieces and stony expressions signaling a level of danger she had only seen in movies. Minho stood beside her, his posture transformed. He stood taller, despite his healing injuries, radiating an aura of command that made the security detail bow their heads in respect. A man with graying hair and a sharp, worried face rushed forward, Director Park, his most loyal confidant. He bowed low, speaking rapidly in Korean, his relief palpable even to Keisha. He handed Minho a long overcoat, heavy wool that cost more than Keisha made in a year, and draped it over his shoulders. The transformation was complete. The man in the tattered clothes was gone, replaced by Chairman Han. Keisha took a step back, the physical manifestation of his wealth acting like a barrier pushing her away. She wrapped her thin cardigan tighter around herself, feeling suddenly exposed and incredibly small. This was his world. She was just a footnote in his survival story. She expected him to walk away, to get into the safety of the armored car and drive off into a life she couldn't comprehend. But Minho stopped. He ignored the urgent gestures of his security team, ignored the open door of the waiting vehicle, and turned back to her. He saw the retreat in her eyes, the way she was already erasing herself from the narrative to save herself the pain of abandonment. He walked back to her, breaking the security perimeter, causing his guards to tense nervously. He stopped inches from her, oblivious to the rain beginning to spot the pavement again. "Keisha," he said, his voice cutting through the noise of the idling engines. He took her cold hands in his, chafing them to bring back warmth. "This isn't goodbye. This is the intermission." He reached into the pocket of the coat he had just been given and pulled out a sleek, black titanium card. No numbers, just a chip and a signature. He pressed it into her palm, closing her fingers over it. "If you need anything at all before I return. But I will be fast." "Go," she whispered, her heart breaking and swelling all at once. "Go take back what's yours." He looked at her one last time, imprinting her face into his mind as his motivation for the war he was about to wage in the boardroom. He leaned in, whispering in her ear so only she could hear. "You are what is mine." He pulled away, turned, and walked into the waiting convoy. The door slammed shut with a heavy thud of finality. As the cars peeled away, disappearing into the wet city night, Keisha stood alone on the curb, the mysterious black card heavy in her hand, the ghost of his warmth still lingering on her skin. She was back in the silence, but the silence was different now. It was filled with a terrifying, fragile hope. 3 days passed in a blur of anxiety and silence. Keisha went back to the diner, moving through her shifts like a ghost. The card Minho had given her sat on her dresser, untouched. She was too proud, too afraid to use it, fearing that if she did, it would transactionalize what they had shared. She wanted him, not his money. But the world was not kind to pride. The landlord, a greasy man named Mr. Henderson who smelled of stale cigars and cruelty, came knocking on Friday morning. He didn't care about her extra shifts or her pleas. He stood in her doorway, blocking the light, a sneer on his face as he looked past her at the sparse apartment. "Time's up, Keisha," he spat. "I got a couple willing to pay double what you pay. You're out. Noon today or the sheriff comes." The devastation was absolute. Keisha sat on the floor amidst half-packed boxes, the fight finally draining out of her. She had saved a life. She had touched something extraordinary, but gravity was pulling her back down to the mud. She thought of Minho, wondering if he was safe, wondering if he had forgotten the girl in the red vest now that he was back in his silk sheets. The clock ticked mercilessly toward noon. She heard heavy footsteps on the stairs, and she braced herself for the sheriff, for the humiliation of being put out on the street. She stood up, wiping her eyes, determined to walk out with her head high. She opened the door before they could knock. But it wasn't the sheriff. It was Mr. Henderson, but he was pale, sweating profusely, and bowing repeatedly to a figure standing behind him. Keisha's breath caught. It was Minho. But not the Minho she knew, and not just the fleeting glimpse of the chairman she had seen in the street. This was a man in his element, wearing a charcoal three-piece suit that fit like a second skin, flanked by 2 lawyers who looked like they could sue God. But when his eyes met hers, the power dynamic crumbled. He pushed past the trembling landlord as if the man were made of smoke and stepped into the apartment. The look on his face was one of pure devastation that he hadn't been there sooner. "I told you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, ignoring the stunned audience in the hallway. "I told you I wouldn't let you lose this place." "Min," she breathed, the name feeling inadequate for the figure before her. He reached her in a second, pulling her into his arms, burying his face in her neck. He was shaking slightly. "I'm sorry," he murmured against her skin. "I was delayed. The board. It was a fight. I came as soon as I could." He pulled back and looked at the landlord, his expression shifting from lover to executioner. "Mr. Henderson," Minho said, his voice dangerously calm. "You are evicting the woman who saved my life?" The landlord stammered, his eyes bulging as he realized who stood before him, the face that had been splashed across every news channel for the last 48 hours as their resurrected heir. I didn't know, sir." Minho cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Get out. And send the deed to my lawyers. I'm buying the building." Now, as the landlord scrambled away, Minho turned back to Keisha, the hardness melting away instantly. "Pack a bag," he said softly, brushing a curl from her forehead. "Not because you have to leave, but because I cannot spend another night away from you." The transition from the cramped studio apartment to Minho's world was a sensory overload that Keisha struggled to process. His estate was a sprawling sanctuary of glass and stone overlooking the city skyline, a fortress of solitude and wealth. But what struck Keisha wasn't the opulence, the heated floors, the art on the walls, the staff who moved like shadows, but the way Minho navigated it with her. He didn't parade her around like a trophy. He protected her, creating a space where they could just be 2 people again. That evening, after a quiet dinner where the staff had been dismissed so they could eat alone, they sat on the expansive terrace. The city lights twinkled below, a sea of diamonds that felt cold compared to the warmth of the fire pit beside them. Keisha sat on the plush outdoor sofa, feeling the silk of the dress he had provided for her, simple, elegant, and blue. She felt like an imposter in her own skin. "I don't belong here, Min," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm a waitress. I scrub tables. This, she gestured to the skyline. This is a fantasy, Minho, who had been pouring wine, set the bottle down and walked over to her. He knelt before her, disregarding the expensive fabric of his trousers against the stone patio. It was a position of submission, of worship, that shocked her. He took her hands, observing the calluses, the rough skin from years of harsh detergents and hard labor. He brought her hands to his lips, kissing the rough patches, the scars, the evidence of her struggle. You are wrong, he said, looking up at her with fierce intensity. You are the only thing that is real in this entire house. All of this. He waved a hand at the luxury around them. This is just noise. It is cold. It is empty. He placed her hand against his heart, letting her feel the steady, strong rhythm beneath the suit. You are the reason this heart beats. When I was in that alley, when I was trash, you didn't see a trillionaire. You saw a human being. That makes you more noble than anyone I have ever met in these high towers. Tears streamed down Keisha's face, the deep-seated insecurity of a lifetime of poverty cracking under the weight of his adoration. He wasn't trying to change her. He was honoring her. I don't want you to be a princess, he continued, wiping her tears with his thumb. I want you to be my partner. My conscience. I need you to keep me human, Keisha. Because without you, I am just a suit in an empty room. He stood then, pulling her up with him, and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him. The wind whipped around them, high above the world, but she felt anchored. Stay with me, he pleaded softly. Not as a guest. As my equal. Keisha looked into his dark eyes and saw the truth of it. He needed her just as much as she needed him. The rescue hadn't been a one-way street. She had saved his life, but he was saving her soul from the grind of survival. Okay, she whispered, leaning into the kiss that followed.
I'm staying.
6 months later, the Jerry's all-night diner sign was still buzzing with that erratic hum, but the atmosphere inside had changed. It wasn't because of a renovation, but because of the couple sitting in the back booth, the booth that had the best view of the alleyway exit. Minho wore a casual sweater, looking years younger than the stressed executive, and Keisha wore a coat that was elegant but understated, her hand resting comfortably in his. They came here every month, a ritual to remember where they had started. The manager, who used to yell at Keisha, now brought them coffee with a nervous, respectful smile, still trying to reconcile that his former employee was now the partner of the city's most powerful man. It looks different from this side of the window, Minho mused, looking out at the spot where the dumpster stood. The rain was falling again, a soft drizzle that blurred the neon lights. It looks smaller. Keisha squeezed his hand, tracing the line of his knuckles. It is smaller, she agreed. Because we outgrew it, her life had changed in ways she couldn't have imagined. She was studying nursing now, a dream she had buried under bills years ago, supported by a man who celebrated every exam grade as if it were a stock market victory. They had used his resources to open a foundation for the homeless, specifically targeting the invisible people of the city, the ones dumped like trash by a cruel system. It was their shared project, their way of turning their trauma into healing. I was thinking, Minho said, turning his gaze from the window to her face. The love in his eyes had settled into something deep and abiding, a quiet ocean compared to the stormy passion of the beginning. We should buy this place. Turn it into a shelter. A real kitchen, Keisha laughed, the sound bright and free, devoid of the exhaustion that used to weigh her down. You want to buy the diner where I got yelled at for moving too slow? She teased.
Minho smiled, a genuine, lopsided grin.
I want to buy the place where an angel found me. I want to put a plaque right there. He pointed to the alley. Here, life began. Keisha leaned across the table, kissing him gently, tasting coffee and contentment. We don't need a plaque, Min, she whispered. We have the story, and they did. It was a story etched in the scars on his ribs and the calluses on her hands, a narrative of redemption that proved that even in the darkest alleys, amidst the refuse of the world, something priceless could be found. She rested her head on his shoulder as they watched the rain, the poor waitress and the Korean trillionaire, bound not by the money in his bank account, but by the night she refused to look away. Their life together was just beginning, And for the first time in Keisha's memory, the future didn't look like a struggle. It looked like a promise kept.